There's a very specific kind of silence inside an abandoned building. It's thick, heavy, the kind of quiet that completely swallows the sounds of the living city just outside its walls. You step through a rotting doorframe, past peeling wallpaper and crumbling brick, and suddenly, you're totally isolated. For some of us, these decaying spaces hold a dark kind of beauty, like concrete ghosts waiting to be explored. But in the mid 1980s, in the shadow of a rapidly booming Atlanta, these empty, gutted structures weren't just forgotten architecture, they were a trap. While the rest of the city looked the other way, a predator was using the ruins of the urban landscape to hide his work. He targeted men living on the margins. They were young, black, and queer, luring them off the neon streets and into the dark, ensuring they never walked back out. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Matt, and this is Homicidal Tendency. Today, we're stepping into the forgotten alleyways of 1985 to uncover the brutal, unseen reign of Michael Terry. Before we head down to Atlanta and get into the timeline of today's case, I want to say a quick thank you to everyone tuning in. If you're enjoying these deep dives into the forgotten, darker chapters of queer crime, the absolute best way to keep the show alive is to hit that follow button and subscribe wherever you're listening right now. Also, taking 2 seconds to drop a rating and review does a massive amount of heavy lifting for me. It helps drag these underreported stories out of the dark and into the algorithms so other true crime fans can help find us. And if you want to see exactly what we're talking about today, come stalk us on the social media. You can find us on Instagram and TikTok at Homicidal Tendency. I'll also drop a link for all the socials in the show notes. I'll be posting photos of the decaying 1980s Atlanta architecture that we'll be exploring in this episode, alongside with the usual stream of photos from the case. All right, grab your flashlights and let's get into it. Digging into Michael Devern Terry's childhood and early life actually presents one of the most glaring and frustrating aspects of this story. Because the case was so severely underreported, the deep investigative journalism that normally uncovers a serial killer's family trauma, psychological evaluations, or early childhood red flags, it simply doesn't exist for Terry in the mainstream public records. However, the scarcity of the information is a powerful talking point in itself. It perfectly highlights how little the media and the justice system cared about the people involved in this case. Here's the concrete background information available to us. Terry was born in 1960 in the small town of Tallahassee, Alabama. The first major documented red flag is that he dropped out of high school in the 10th grade. While there's no public record for the specific family dynamics or trauma that preceded this, it marked the immediate beginning of his criminal escalation. Almost immediately after dropping out, Terry began amassing a serious criminal record. By his late teens and early 20s, he had already had convictions for burglary, robbery, simple battery, aggravated assault, and carrying an unlicensed firearm. The justice system had multiple opportunities to recognize a rapidly escalating violent offender, but he repeatedly slipped through the cracks. But if you actually look at the specific charges he racked up in his late teens and early 20s, it's not just a list of random petty crimes, it's a terrifyingly clear blueprint of escalation. It started with the burglary and robbery. In the true crime world, we talk about boundary testing. Burglary is the ultimate violation of someone's safe space. It's about crossing a line, entering a domain where you do not belong, and taking what you want. Robbery, that takes it a step further. It introduces a face to face confrontation, fear, and power dynamics. He was learning how to take control of the situation. Then the charges shift. He moves from property crime to simple battery and aggravated assault. This is a critical turning point. He's no longer just taking things, he's actively testing his capacity to physically dominate and hurt other human beings. Aggravated assault, it's not a mistake, it's a rehearsal. Serial predators rarely start with murder, they practice. They test their own tolerance for violence. And Terry, he was getting comfortable with it. And finally, there's the linchpin carrying an unlicensed firearm. We know from his neighbors in Atlanta that Terry was deeply paranoid and he carried a gun on him inside his own house. But having an illegal firearm charge on top of a history of aggravated assault is a blaring siren. He wasn't just armed for self defense, he was securing the ultimate tool of lethal control. By the time he packed up and moved across state lines to Atlanta in 1983, the rehearsal was over. He was ready for the main event. And unfortunately, he found a city where the people he chose to target were completely unprotected by the very system that let him walk. To really understand how Michael Terry operated, we have to pull back and look at the physical environment of Atlanta in 1985. If you were to look through a lens of a camera at the city's skyline back then, you would see a metropolis obsessed with its own future. This was the era of the New South. Atlanta was aggressively branding itself as the city that's too busy to hate. You had massive glittering glass skyscrapers going up, the MARTA transit system was expanding, and neon signs illuminating a booming downtown. The city was practically vibrating with 80s excess and ambition, desperately trying to polish its image for a national stage. But the polished glass and neon was only half the picture. The extreme speed of that gentrification and construction had violently fractured the city. When they built the massive highway interchanges, the downtown connector, it literally bulldozed through the historic, low-income black neighborhoods, cutting them off and leaving them to rot. So, right underneath these gleaming new high-rises, you have these sprawling pockets of intense urban decay. It was a landscape of stark contrast. You could walk just a few blocks away from a bustling commercial center and suddenly find yourself surrounded by skeletal remains of forgotten architecture, gutted apartment complexes, overgrown alleyways, and boarded up brick buildings where the streetlights had been shattered and never replaced. For anyone drawn to the eerie quiet of abandoned spaces, these ruins held a specific kind of heavy atmosphere. But in 1985, they weren't just empty concrete, they were blind spots. The police didn't patrol them, and the city didn't maintain them. And this is exactly where the city's most vulnerable populations were pushed. The queer community in the South during the 80s was already fighting a massive battle against the intense religious conservatism and then the terrifyingly heavily stigmatized rise of the AIDS epidemic. And for black queer men, especially those surviving through sex work or living on the streets, the isolation, it was absolute. They were forced into these decaying, unlit zones to find community, to hustle, or just to exist out of sight. Terry didn't have to drag his victims out into the woods or drive them across straight lines. The city had already built the perfect, undisturbed hunting grounds right in its own backyard. The shadows of those forgotten buildings provided all the cover he would ever need. And like I said, by 1983, Michael Terry had packed his bags, crossed state lines, and settled into Atlanta. He bounced around a couple rooming houses, eventually landing at 664 Kennesaw Avenue. He kept his head down, worked blue-collar jobs like a tire shop, and carried a gun everywhere he went. He was an incredibly volatile man looking for a release valve. And unfortunately, he arrived in Atlanta at the exact perfect moment a devastating storm was brewing for the city's marginalized queer community. To understand how a killer could murder six men and leave their bodies in abandoned buildings and without setting off massive alarm bells, you have to understand the reality of Atlanta in the mid 1980s. On paper, the city was rapidly growing, heavily branded as the new black mecca of the South. But that prosperity was sharply divided by geography and class. Terry didn't hunt in the affluent suburbs. He loitered around the Martin Luther King Jr. Drive and the shadow of the Georgia Baptist Hospital. These victims were existing at the brutal intersection of three massive societal failures. First, the systematic racism that pushed them into the neglected, decaying neighborhoods. Second, the deep, paralyzing homophobia that forced many of them to live double lives, entirely disconnected from any safety net. And third, the terrifying peak of the early AIDS panic. In 1985, an HIV diagnosis was essentially a death sentence. The government was looking the other way. and fear had completely fractured the community. So, when young queer black men started disappearing or turning up dead in vacant lots, the public and the police largely dismissed it as street violence or tragic inevitability of a high risk lifestyle, which is all bullshit. They didn't see a serial killer, they just saw people who had already been written off. Terry knew all of this. He didn't even have to hunt them aggressively, he just leaned against the brick walls of abandoned buildings and waited. He knew that if he lured these men into the shadow, had sex with them, and then violently ended their lives, no one was going to come looking. When we talk about the hustling scene in 1980s Atlanta, we have to strip away the cinematic stereotypes. This wasn't glamorous. For the young men working the streets around Martin Luther King Jr. Drive, Ponce de Leon Avenue, or the shadows behind the Georgia Baptist Hospital, it was pure, unadulterated survival. In the mid 1980s, the gay rights movement in Atlanta was gaining traction, but it was incredibly segregated. The visible mainstream queer scene, the established bars, the political organizations, the safe spaces in Midtown, they were predominantly white and largely affluent. If you were a young black queer man, especially if you've been kicked out of your home or were living in poverty, those doors were largely closed to you. So you made your own spaces. And for many, that meant hitting the stroll. The stroll was an ecosystem of its own. It was a network of specific street corners, bus stops, and late night diners where men gathered to find clients. You had teenagers who had just arrived at the Greyhound station with nowhere to go, mingling with older men who had been working the streets for years. They were trading sex for cash, for a hot meal, or just for a safe place to sleep for a few hours. But the vulnerability of that life, it's terrifying to think about. Every time a car pulled up and rolled down its window, these men had to make a split second life or death calculation. Is this guy a cop looking to make a brutal vice arrest? Is he a violent homophobe looking to bash a queer kid? Or is he just a closeted businessman from the suburbs looking for a quick, discreet encounter? You had to read that stranger's eyes in the dark and decide if getting into that passenger seat was worth the $20. And remember, the era that we're talking about, it's 1985. The AIDS epidemic is tearing through the community like wildfire. And there was no treatment, there was only panic. The very act of physical intimacy had become intertwined with the fear of a slow, agonizing death. So you take that overwhelming existential dread and you stack it on top of the immediate physical danger of getting into a stranger's car in the middle of the night. That was the daily reality of these men. They were forced to operate completely under the radar. And because they had to hide from the police and from society, they were pushed further out into the fringes of the city, right into those dark, decaying urban ruins that we talked about. They had to seek out the blind spots, which meant when a soft spoken, seemingly normal guy named Michael Terry offered them cash and suggested they head to the shadows for a quick tryst, it didn't seem like a trap. It seemed like another night on the stroll. So you have these men pushed into the literal and metaphorical dark. But the question that always comes up in these cases like this is, where are the police? It's a stroll. It's a known area where illegal sex work is happening. The brutal reality is that for the men on the stroll, the police weren't a source of protection. They were just another predator to avoid. In the 1980s in Atlanta, the relationship between the police department and the queer community was deeply antagonistic. The APD had a dedicated vice squad, and their primary interaction with the gay community consisted of aggressive bar raids, harassment, and entrapment. Undercover cops would frequently pose as clients to arrest gay men and sex workers, completely destroying their lives and outing them to local papers. For the young black men working in the streets, the threat was magnified by deeply ingrained systematic racism. If a patrol car rolled slowly past the gutted apartment building, the men hiding inside didn't run out asking for help. They held their breath and prayed the headlights didn't sweep over them. To be seen by police meant risking a brutal arrest, physical violence, or being thrown into the jail system that was already terrifyingly indifferent to their safety. And this is where the apathy becomes lethal. When you have a marginalized group that actually has to hide from law enforcement just to survive, they become the perfect prey. Because when one of them goes missing, who's going to report it? Their families often didn't know about their lifestyle or had already disowned them. The other men on the stroll couldn't exactly walk into the precinct and say, "Hey, my friend who also illegally sells sex disappeared after getting into a stranger's car." And even when the bodies were found, dumped in those decaying ruins we talked about, the investigations were practically non existent. In the mid 80s across the country, detectives often viewed the murders of gay men, sex workers, and drug addicts as self correcting problems. They were quote unquote less dead. There was no public outcry, there were no task force, just a few lines in the back pages of the newspaper, chalked up to the dangerous hazards of a street lifestyle. So Michael Terry didn't need to be an evil genius to evade the police. He just needed to hunt the people the police had already decided weren't worth saving. When we look at the specific way Michael Terry operated, his MO, we have to confront a massive, deeply ingrained myth about true crime. If you ask the average person to picture a serial killer, thanks to decades of movies and sensationalized news coverage, they're going to picture a white man in his 30s. Because of that, there is a persistent assumption that a black serial killer, especially one targeting other black men, is some kind of extreme statistical anomaly. But if you look at the actual data, that couldn't be further from the truth. According to the major serial homicide databases, black offenders make up a highly significant percentage of serial killers in the United States, especially from the 1980s onward. And furthermore, more importantly, serial murder is overwhelmingly intra-racial. White killers generally target white victims, and black killers generally target black victims, with the piece of shit Ronald Dominique from episode 1 being one of the exceptions. The reason Michael Terry's profile seems rare isn't because of the statistics, it's because of media erasure. The press and the public simply do not obsess over black killers murdering marginalized black victims. They don't get the front page spreads, the documentaries, or the catchy nicknames. They get ignored. And that systematic indifference is exactly what allowed Terry to perfect his MO. When we break down his modus operandi, it's terrifyingly efficient, and it revolves entirely around exploiting that apathy. Terry didn't stalk his victims through the woods, and he didn't force them into a vehicle at gunpoint. He used the transactional nature of the stroll. He presented himself as a client, offering cash for a quick encounter. It was a voluntary, albeit financially desperate, transaction that completely lowered the victim's guard. He weaponized the decaying urban landscape. He specifically guided these men into the pitch black, abandoned apartment buildings, the overgrown alleyways, and desolate parks. He knew the police were not patrolling these ruins, and he knew the heavy concrete and isolation would muffle any sound. Terry was a complete fucking coward. He almost never attacked face to face. Once the men were physically vulnerable and distracted, often during or immediately after the sexual encounter, he initiated a blitz attack from behind. He either shot them directly in the back of the head or inflicted massive frenzied stab wounds to the neck. There was no prolonged captivity or torture. It was immediate. Lethal violence designed to extinguish a life before the victim could even fight back. And finally, then there's the signature. In true crime, the MO is what the killer needs to do to commit the crime, but the signature is what they do to satisfy their own twisted psychology. For Terry, that signature was the degradation of bodies. Almost all of his victims were found nude from the waist down. It wasn't about the murder, it was about leaving them exposed, stripped of their dignity, and discarded like trash in the rubble of the city. When a high profile serial killer's victims are white, affluent, or middle class, the media usually paints a full, tragic portrait of their lives. We learn about their dreams, their hobbies, their grieving families. But the men Michael Terry killed, they were black, queer, and surviving on the streets during the height of the 1980s AIDS crisis. The newspapers barely gave them a paragraph. The police, they gave them less. We don't have deep personal biographies on these men. And the absence of the information is exactly the point. It shows completely how society abandoned them. But we're going to say their names, and we're going to track exactly how a predator was allowed to operate in the shadows of a major city for almost a year. All right, trigger warning. It's about to get heavy. So, December 6th, 1985, the spree officially begins. The body of 24-year-old Richard Williams is discovered inside a decaying, vacant building behind a house at 867 Mason Turner Road. This was exactly the kind of forgotten ruined architecture Terry sought out. Richard had been shot in the back of the head, an execution style killing, and then stabbed twice. It was brutal, personal, and immediately discarded by the police as standard street violence. December 14th, 1985, barely a week later, Curtis Lee Brown, who was only 21 years old, is found dead in an overgrown, isolated section of Dean Rusk Park on Peapley Street. Terry used the exact same method. Curtis was shot twice, with a fatal bullet entering the back of his head. The immediate repetition shows the killer, who isn't panicking, he's settling into a rhythm. After Curtis, Terry seemingly goes quiet for the winter, but as the weather starts to warm up, the violence, it escalates. March 20th, 1986. The body of 31-year-old Alvin George is found dumped in a desolate alleyway on Kennesaw Avenue. This time, Terry didn't use a gun. Alvin was stabbed multiple times in the neck. The violence was becoming more frenzied, more hands on, and this location, Kennesaw Avenue, is crucial. Terry lived in a rooming house on that exact street. He was getting incredibly brazen, leaving bodies practically on his own doorstep. April 6th, 1986, just 2.5 weeks later, 18-year-old Jason B. McCauley is discovered. Jason was just a teenager, barely an adult, likely trying to survive on the stroll. His body was found in the exact same Kennesaw Avenue alleyway as Alvin George. His cause of death was identical, multiple vicious stab wounds to the neck. Terry takes another break through the summer, but when he returns in the fall, the brutality hits an absolute peak. September 13th, 1986, 30-year-old George Willingham is found in a lonely, overgrown field near a freeway leading to Stone Mountain. The crime scene was a bloodbath. George wasn't just murdered, he was subjected to overkill. Terry shot him 3 times in the back of the head, stabbed him twice, and then physically mutilated his body. It was an explosion of deeply internalized rage and hatred. October 20th, 1986, the final known victim. The body of 20-year-old Daryl O. Williams, no relation to the first victim, Richard, is found inside an abandoned, rotting apartment building on Harwell Street. This was just a few blocks away from where the spree began just a year prior. Daryl had been killed with a single gunshot wound to the back of the head. 6 men, ages 18 to 31, hunted, used, and thrown away in the ruins of Atlanta. Almost all of them found partially nude, completely exposed to the elements. For nearly a year, Michael Terry had treated the streets of Atlanta like his personal hunting ground. But leaving 2 bodies in an alleyway right next to your own house isn't the move of a criminal mastermind. It's the move of a man who firmly believes no one is looking for him. And finally, he was wrong. For almost a year, Michael Terry operated with total impunity because he believed correctly for a long time that no one was looking for these men. But eventually, the sheer volume of bodies, the specific demographic of the victims, and the identical execution styles forced the Atlanta Police Department to acknowledge they had a massive problem on their hands. Under the command of Major Horace Walker, the police finally began connecting the dots. They realized they weren't dealing with random acts of violence. They were tracking a highly organized predator. But the real break in the case, it didn't come from brilliant detective work or cutting-edge 1980s forensics. It came from the killer's own arrogance. Remember the third and fourth victims, Alvin George and 18-year-old Jason McCauley? They were both dumped, their bodies in the exact same desolate alleyway of Kennesaw Avenue, just 2.5 weeks apart. What Terry apparently forgot or just didn't care about was that he lived at 664 Kennesaw Avenue. He was literally leaving his victims practically at his own doorstep. When the police began aggressively canvassing the neighborhood, knocking on doors and asking locals if they'd seen anything unusual, it didn't take long for them to start hearing the same name over and over again. Neighbors pointed to the strange loner down the street who always seemed to carry a gun. The detectives, they pulled Michael Terry's file, saw he had an escalating rap sheet from Alabama, and realized they had their guy. The arrest itself was almost anticlimactic. On November 26, 1986, Atlanta police drove out to a dusty, loud tire recapping shop in the suburb of Lithonia. They walked in, found Michael Devern Terry covered in grease, and they cuffed him. There was no chase, no shootout, just a 26-year-old guy clocking out of his shift for the last time. But the real psychological horror of this case, it didn't happen in the alleyways. It happened inside the interrogation room. When detectives finally got Terry into the box, they were dealing with a man who had completely convinced himself of his own invincibility. For a year, he had treated the city like his own personal hunting ground, and society's apathy had validated him every single time he pulled the trigger or swung a knife. So, when the police laid out the evidence, the bodies dumped right down the street from his rooming house, the matching execution styles, the timeline, Terry, he didn't lawyer up. He didn't sit in stony silence like you see in the movies. He talked. Terry freely admitted to the police that he engaged in sexual encounters with all six men, and then he calmly admitted to killing every single one of them. But here's where the absolute sickening arrogance of Michael Terry reveals itself. He didn't confess to being a serial killer. He looked the detectives dead in the eye and claimed that every single one of those six murders was an act of self-defense. He tried to spin this absurd, deeply insulting narrative that after sexual encounters, these men would suddenly be aggressive over payments or that they were trying to take advantage of him. He wanted the police to believe that six separate times he was the actual victim, forced to use lethal violence just to survive a bad transaction on the stroll. Let's pause and look at the physical reality of his self-defense claim. Richard Williams, shot in the back of the head. Curtis Lee Brown, shot in the back of the head. Darrell Williams, shot in the back of the head. Alvin George and Jason McCauley, blitz attacked and stabbed violently in the neck. You do not shoot someone in the back of the head in self-defense. This is an execution. This is a predator striking when their prey's back is literally turned. But Terry's defense wasn't based on forensics or logic. It was based on bigotry. He banked on the idea that because his victims were marginalized, queer, black men working the streets, the police would instinctively view them as inherently dangerous or untrustworthy. He thought that the police would agree. The detectives would nod along and pat him on the back and say, yeah, those street workers, they're trouble. We get it. But he was wrong. The detectives didn't buy a single word of it. They officially charged him with 6 counts of murder. But there is something we need to think about here. There is a terrifying 2-year blank space in the official narrative of Michael Terry. He arrived in Atlanta in 1983, a transient guy with a violent rap sheet from Alabama. But according to the police timeline, he didn't claim his first victim until the winter of 1985. In the true crime world, we know predators, they don't just sit dormant for 2 years while carrying an illegal firearm and harboring a deep-seated rage. They practice. How many missing person reports from 1983 and 1984 were completely ignored by the Atlanta Police Department? How many young black queer men simply vanished from the stroll without a trace? Their disappearance written off as runaways or drug casualties. Terry was officially charged with 6 murders. But anyone looking closely at that 2-year gap has to wonder, how many bodies are still out there, buried beneath the concrete of the New South, that we'll never know about? The trial of Michael Terry was, frankly, an absolute circus of its own making. When you have a defendant who confesses on tape and then completely changes the story by the time he gets in front of a judge, it creates a very specific kind of chaos in the courtroom. In February of 1987, Terry faced his first trial. The state decided to try him for the murders of Richard Williams and Curtis Lee Brown, the first two victims from December 1985. He stood in front of a jury of 3 men and 9 women, and this is where he officially revoked his entire confession. He threw out the deeply insulting self defense story and instead claimed confessed only because the cops wouldn't believe anything else he said. It was desperate, it was transparent. The jury didn't buy it for a second. They looked at the physical evidence, the execution style gunshot wounds, and found him guilty on both accounts. He was handed 2 consecutive life sentences. But the state wasn't done with him yet. The following year, prosecutors brought Terry back to the court for the murder of George Willingham. Now, if you remember in the timeline, George's murder was the one that involved massive overkill and physical mutilation. Because of the extreme, aggravating circumstances of that specific crime scene, the state decided to go for the ultimate punishment. They wanted the death penalty. The trial was intense, but when it came time for sentencing, the jury was hopelessly deadlocked over whether to send him to death row because they couldn't reach a unanimous decision on the execution. The preceding judge, Justice John Langford, stepped in and imposed a third consecutive life sentence instead. At this point, Terry is staring down 3 consecutive life terms. The writing's on the wall. He knew he was never getting out, and the state still had 3 more murders to charge him with. So, to avoid the spectacle of endless trials, Michael Terry finally folded. He entered a guilty plea for the remaining 3 murders: Alvin George, Jason McConley, and Darrell O. Williams. For those pleas, he received 3 more consecutive life sentences. 6 men murdered, 6 life sentences. Today, Michael Devern Terry remains locked inside the Georgia prison system. He has spent the last 4 decades rotting in a cell, completely isolated from the society he terrorized, which is exactly where he belongs. So I try to remain impartial, when I'm recording these episodes and researching and all that stuff. But I have to say, man, I really hate this piece of shit. He's just the fucking worst. We know how Michael Terry killed these 6 men. We know where he left them. But the question that always lingers in the dark is why? Why did he do it? Terry never gave a true motive. He stuck to his ridiculous, bigoted claim of self defense. But when you strip away the lies and look at the actual behavior at the crime scenes, a terrifying psychological profile starts to emerge, and it points directly to a massive, lethal case of internalized homophobia. Think about the sequence of events. Terry wasn't just snatching guys off the street and killing them immediately. He was engaging in their services. He was taking them to secluded, abandoned spaces and having sexual encounters with them. In behavioral analysis, when a killer engages in same-sex encounter and then immediately responds with lethal violence, it's often described as destroying the mirror. Terry was acting out on his deeply repressed, heavily stigmatized sexual desires, but the second the encounter was over, the reality of what he had just done and what it meant to his own identity would crash down around him. That intense, internalized shame and self-disgust instantly transmuted into rage. But instead of directing that rage towards himself, he projected it onto these men he was with. By killing them, he was violently trying to erase the evidence of his own sexuality. He was punishing them for the desires he couldn't accept within himself. You can see this hatred physically manifested in the crime scene. Look at the signature we talked about earlier. Almost all the victims were found nude from the waist down. It wasn't a logistical choice, it was a psychological one. It was about degradation. Terry wanted to leave these men exposed and humiliated in the ruins of the city, because that's exactly how he viewed his own desire, as something dirty, broken, and shameful. And when you look at the murder of George Willingham, the victim who was shot, stabbed, and brutally mutilated, this is the ultimate explosion of internalized hate. You don't mutilate someone just to kill them. You mutilate them to obliterate their identity. And in Terry's twisted mind, to obliterate the part of himself he hated the most. What a piece of shit. Michael Terry didn't just weaponize the decaying architecture of Atlanta. He weaponized his own self-hatred, turning his internal war into a physical nightmare for 6 men who were just trying to survive the night. Whenever we look back at a serial killer operating in the 1980s, we expect to see those classic, screaming tabloid headlines. We expect the panic, the press conferences, the bold print asking, "Who is the killer?" But if you go back and search the archives for the major Atlanta papers from December 1985 to October 1986, you aren't going to find a sprawling, panicked narrative about a predator stalking the city. You're going to practically find nothing. As the bodies were being pulled out of the overgrown parks and the abandoned buildings, the local news didn't connect the dots. When the murders were reported at all, they were neglected to tiny black page blurbs. The press quickly dismissed the deaths as routine street violence or the unfortunate consequence of high risk lifestyle. This lack of coverage wasn't an accident, it was a direct reflection of who the victims were. In the mid 80s, the media simply did not care about the murders of young queer black men. Press completely erased their humanity. It wasn't until Michael Terry was actually arrested in November of 1986 that the local media finally woke up. Suddenly, they had a serial killer on their hands. And the story made the front page. But even then, the framing was completely dehumanizing. On November 29th, 1986, the Atlanta Journal Constitution ran the story with the headline Atlantan held in slayings of six male street hustlers. Looking at the specific wording, the paper didn't call them victims. They didn't call them men. They put the phrase street hustlers in quotation marks right in the headline. The press used the label to instantly stigmatize them, to signal to their readers that these victims were living on the fringes of society, participating in illegal sex work. It was a way of quietly shifting the blame, implying that by being on the stroll, they had somehow invited the violence upon themselves. So, classic victim blaming, classic piece of shit behavior. Michael Terry didn't just exploit the physical ruins of the city to hide his crimes. He exploited a media landscape that had already decided these victims were invisible. By refusing to cover the early murders with any real investigative scrutiny, the press gave a serial killer nearly a year of absolute, undisturbed silence to do his worst. When a high profile true crime case wraps up, we usually get a neat cinematic epilogue. We hear about sweeping legislative changes, police task force being formed, or massive community memorials. But the aftermath of the Atlanta street hustler murders was defined by the exact thing that allowed them to happen in the first place silence. Once Michael Terry was convicted and handed 6 consecutive life sentences, the media completely dropped the story. The city of Atlanta moved on. The decaying, abandoned buildings where these men lost their lives were eventually bulldozed over to make way for new developments, luxury apartments, and continued gentrification of the New South. The physical scars of Terry's hunting ground, they were just paved over. And as for Michael Devern Terry himself, there's no dramatic recent update. And honestly, that's exactly how it should be. He didn't get a Netflix special. He didn't get a cult following. The prison system simply swallowed him whole. Today, he is in his mid 60s, sitting in a cell within the Georgia Department of Corrections, and that's where he'll sit until he dies. He's exhausted his appeals, and the state's thrown away the key. But the true aftermath of this case isn't about Michael Terry, it's about the legacy of the men he targeted. For decades, the murder of Richard, Curtis, Alvin, George, Jason, and Daryl were neglected to an obscure footnote in Atlanta's history. But in recent years, as the true crime community has slowly started to confront its own biases, cases like this are finally being dragged back into the light. And we're finally starting to talk about the lethal intersection of racism, homophobia, and sex work. The monsters aren't always wearing masks, and they aren't always hiding in the woods. Sometimes they're just waiting in the spaces the rest of the world decided to ignore. Keep your eyes open, keep your community close, and remember, the dark is only empty until someone steps into it. I'm Matt, and this has been Homicidal Tendency. Stay safe, and I'll see you next time.